All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to you, whoever you are. Thanks for choosing to listen today. If you've been around in recent weeks, you heard me mention that this time of year, this December month, I often find myself falling back into an old ritual, which is to reflect back on the year, not just from my own individual perspective, but to see if I could get a sense of what's going on in the larger yoga world, as I used to call it. I also recently mentioned that I'm not sure there is a larger yoga world anymore, at least not as I used to envision it. But I do still have a lot of opportunities to talk to a lot of yoga teachers through this show and through my weekly discussion group. I also have cultivated many relationships over the years, and I keep tabs on stuff like who's going back out on the road, who's teaching this training, You get a sense sometimes of what's been going on. It's definitely been harder to get any kind of read because everything's become so isolated and online and stuff. But one thing that has clearly been true is that there has been a marked paradigm shift, I would say, when it comes to yoga teaching. And that paradigm shift has to do with, one, just the way people present yoga and talk about yoga, and maybe even more so, the relationship between teacher and student and the dynamics there. And over the years of this show, we've had many conversations about guru-disciple relationships and what it means to have an enlightened master. And I think in years past, as I've said many times, I don't feel I always did a very great job of conducting those conversations. I think inside myself, I was looking to stoke controversy. I was getting off on the fact that it was happening on this show. Even though they were important conversations to be having, I think they were, and I know they were. I still reflect back and feel that I would want to do better. And I've certainly tried to do that. I know in the last few weeks, we had some conversations around Kundalini Yoga and Yogi Bhajan. And I would want to take a moment to address some feedback I got from a particular listener who reached out to me and said that they felt alienated by those conversations because they clearly have had positive experiences with Kundalini Yoga, and they felt that the tone of the conversation of debunking and discrediting was kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I suppose, or that there was a judgment happening. And, of course there is judgments that have to be happening on some level. I don't think that judgment is bad, but at the same time, I don't want to take anything away from someone that's meaningful and dear and helpful and important to them. I'm not interested in destroying people's yoga. At the same time, if you're someone like me who has been telling people that you're a yoga teacher for 20, 30, or 40 years, especially if you're someone who, unlike me, has affiliated or associated with a particular tradition or spiritual leader, and either way, whether it's a spiritual leader or it's just your own independent kind of inquiries, like folks like me, still your understanding of the different schools of yoga and the history of yoga, they're based on origin stories and claims. And over your years of teaching, you have repeated these origin stories and claims in teaching and sharing what your understanding of yoga history and philosophy and practice is. So if years later, there's these researchers discovering that some of these origin stories couldn't have been true the way that they were told, you can ignore that. You can just be like, oh, I don't know what they're talking about, and just not paying any attention. But if you're a thoughtful practitioner, you have to take that in and be like, wow, maybe what I thought was true wasn't as true as I thought. And I think many of us just have had teachers who helped us in lots of ways, but then exhibited behaviors that we couldn't condone. And reconciling that has just been really hard. And especially when there's institutions involved and people's careers involved. So I am really doing my best to engage these conversations in a thoughtful way. I'm not interested in stoking controversy, but I do think there are important questions that have to be asked if we're going to move forward with integrity. And those questions require conversations of nuance. And we have to be able to let someone say what they think. And my talk today with Radha Metro-Midkiff is a perfect opportunity for this. Radha is the executive director of Integral Yoga in New York City. And first, I took some time to learn about Swami Satchidananda and Integral Yoga. And then I did engage her in some of these really difficult questions. And I so appreciate Radha being willing to talk about these difficult things with me and share her honest perspective. I think that's really what we need to be doing today, and I'm grateful for her for engaging in this conversation with me, and I'm glad to be sharing it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, let me mention that if you want to connect with me in ways outside of just listening to this show, there's lots of opportunities for that. If you're doing online classes, I've got weekly practice sessions. If you want to talk about some of this stuff, I've got a weekly discussion group that I just mentioned earlier. I've also got a long-term teacher training deep learning program if you want to do a year-long deep dive. There's also on-demand videos and the podcast premium stuff. All of it can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. We've got a lot to get into today, so we're going to do that. I will touch base with you for a moment on the other side, but let's go ahead and do it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Radha Metro-Midkiff.
Hi.
Hello, Radha.
Hello, Jay. How are you?
I'm good. Nice to meet you. I don't think we've met before.
I don't believe we have, which is interesting because I was seeing we have some friends in common.
Yes, we certainly do. I mean, I came into the yoga world in New York City, so I think we ran in some same circles for sure.
It is possible. However, much of my time was spent in Virginia at Yogaville. So,
right. Oh,
I just had short stints here in New York.
I don't know if you've listened to the show before, but I am already recording, and if it's okay, I want us to consider ourselves having just begun.
Okay, great.
Okay, good. Well, as we were saying, you spent time up in Yogaville, so I guess that makes sense. When did you take on the role of being executive director of the Institute in New York City?
So I've been here about 2 years in this role.
Oh, okay. So that's relatively new.
Yeah. Came in sort of right after COVID. During COVID, we had an interim executive director, and then I came in after that.
I see. Well, maybe as a little bit of a way to kind of get us started today, I would share a few things with you about why Integral Yoga in New York City is a significant place in my life. Even though I never really spent that much time studying, I think I took like a handful of classes there in like the early 90s.
Oh, so maybe our paths did cross, because I actually lived here in 1990, 91, 92, around that time. That was when I was like 18 years old and straight out of high school.
Maybe. Well, I was at that time, had just gotten out of college at NYU, and I had been exposed to yoga while I was at NYU. Actually, no, I was still at NYU. In 92, I started taking classes at Jiva Mukti on 2nd Avenue.
Oh, yeah.
And, at that time, it wasn't like a method like it became so much. They hadn't kind of created Jivamukti method yet. It was just all of these really interesting teachers. And it was a mix of what at that time were like the three main sources for yoga, which were all lineage traditions.
I know, right?
It was Iyengar, there was integral yoga on 13th Street, and then eventually there was like the Ashtanga representation, which Eddie had his place, I remember, like on like Broadway and Houston.
Right.
And so when I started practicing, that was kind of the scene. And for anybody listening here who's come into yoga in the last 10 years, they've come into yoga as a very different thing than at that time, I think, because there wasn't any yoga teacher trainings. And really the way that teachers had like legitimacy in certain ways was like the association you had with whichever lineage it was, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we didn't have anything like Yoga Alliance. There were no governing bodies. There was no, I mean, really, I was just talking to Swami Satchidananda, who's our president here in New York yesterday, and he was saying, yeah, when we got started, there was no teacher training program. It was just, hey, don't you want to teach yoga? Swami Satchidananda can't teach all the yoga classes. So let's start getting people to teach yoga. And so that was the way they trained. And eventually they were like, hey, maybe we should have a manual for this. And then they started putting together manuals, but there was nothing compared to like what it is now where, everything is so formal, which is still, I mean, honestly, to me, it's still kind of a foreign world to me. I mean, I'm still very old school in that way. I really kind of almost don't even consider myself a teacher, even though I've taught off and on over the years. Like I got, my certification in 1990 to teach Hatha Yoga and Raja Yoga that same year. But I didn't really come into yoga to teach, right? I was born into it. So I still have like a little disconnect sometimes around like this new world of teacher trainings. And I know new, right, Radha? Like it's 30 years old.
I mean, that is interesting. Again, a lot of people, when I first started, people who were into yoga, generally speaking, had either gone and stayed at one of the ashrams, Yogaville or Ananda maybe, or they had gone to India and spent time with a teacher there, And then those people all came back and those were my teachers. So I was like the generation after them.
Yeah.
And so for someone like me, I didn't have a guru. I went to India in 1998 to see if I could find one and didn't. But I guess you mentioned that you were born into it and there's not a lot of people who've had that experience. So you were born at Yogaville?
So I was actually, born in Colorado, but my parents got into yoga before I was born. So they were actually studying with Eknatheshwaran. I think they were like going to like Mount Madonna out in California. And then when I was about a year old is when they met Swami Satchidananda in Colorado. And I actually was looking at your guest list. Nishtila Devi was actually their first yoga teacher.
Oh, okay.
Yoga. She was
Nishtila
like my
been on like a bunch
birth.
of times. I love Nishtila. She's great. Yeah.
Yeah, she was actually at my brother's birth. She helped take care of the kids while my brother was being born.
And was that, they met her before they met Swami Satchidananda?
No, they met her afterwards. So,
Okay.
She was like the first person, one of the first people we met in integral yoga. And so I was about 1 when we met Swami Satchidananda. And, I just immediately just was like drawn to him. I mean, I think most people are into yoga, have some belief in reincarnation. And I really felt like, my relationship with him was such like, that I was clearly, part of that purpose of reincarnating at this time was definitely to be with this particular guru and spiritual master, because we were, immediately like we were, in my 1-year-old mind, we were best friends.
Well,
from day one.
I mean, that's a very unusual experience. I mean, most of the people I talk to on the show, when they talk to me about feeling like they've come to find a guide or a guru in their lives, or they've taken on a certain spiritual path. It's often, I always say, like, what did your parents think? You know what I mean? Because it's usually a break from their family traditions, but that your family, your parents were already sort of part of that community kind of makes it different. I suppose I'm curious for people listening who maybe aren't so familiar with the tradition. Maybe you could say something about Swami Satchidananda, like how did he end up becoming a Swami, and then like what was his journey to come to the West?
Oh gosh, to me this is like such a great story, and it's one of the reasons, like, you know, obviously I grew up in this, but at some point you make a choice about whether you want to stay with this tradition or whether there's something else that speaks to you. And I think one of the reasons why I've always stayed with this tradition is partially because of his journey. So, you know, he started off, he was born in South India to this very religious family. There were gurus in his own lineage, like his direct family lineage. And so both his mother and father were very spiritual. But he actually grew up kind of like, you know, wanting to, you know, be in the film industry. I think he worked in the film industry for a while. He worked in, he was an engineer and worked in auto mechanics, and he did all of these like really normal things. He got married. He had 2 kids, really just living like a totally normal life. I'm pretty sure he even smoked cigarettes once upon a time. I know.
There's
right?
pictures somewhere, huh?
I think there's a picture somewhere of him with a cigarette in his younger years. So for me, like, that's what really resonated with me, because not only did he have like this spiritual, like, householder life, but he also understood then the monastic life. So basically, he's married, he has these children, and then originally the story was that his wife had passed away. In later years, there was some hint that perhaps she had actually left him, and that they just said she was dead because she was, you know, dead to the family. But whatever that story is, his wife was gone. And this led to a huge spiritual crisis for him. He basically was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't understand my path anymore. I had all this laid out in front of me. I thought I was doing this thing, and now I'm just completely confused. So he goes and basically, you know, leaves his kids with his mother and goes out on this spiritual journey and starts traveling around, really studying yoga and going to these different ashrams and studying under different masters. I mean, he was really able to study under some of the great masters at the time, like Sri Aurobindo and Chidavananda, and of course, eventually with Master Shivananda. So he's traveling all over India, studying. And one of the other really unique things about integral yoga, Jay, that I think is kind of fascinating is that he has this crossover in his teaching where he starts in the south of India, and the south of India has a very like tantric tradition, right? The Shiva Shakti tradition. And then he goes up and he eventually ends up taking sannyas with Master Shivananda in the north. But he still, in his teachings, really quotes a lot of the southern saints and the southern scriptures, like the Tirukkural by Tiruvalluvar. So it's like we are of the lineage of Master Shivananda, but his teachings and his tradition and the way that he actually transmits his teachings is very different than Master Shivananda. And I think that's part of the reason why, like, we eventually kind of split off. Like, you had Vishnu Devananda, who kind of stayed much more closely, and Chidananda stayed closely to what Master Shivananda was teaching. But with integral yoga, it was like he wove all of this stuff into his teachings and what he learned from Master Shivananda as well. So he actually did his pre-sannyas with Chidavananda, and then he met Master Shivananda. He was only with Master Shivananda for a few short years before he was sent off to do like a world tour and to start Divine Life Society. I think he started in Sri Lanka. And then he goes over to Hong Kong. And when he goes to Hong Kong, that's when he started actually having, I would say, more of like a reputation of his own followers, because that's when the Hari Leela family met him, and he met the Dharinani family. And they were very instrumental in bringing him and keeping him in the West. And then, I think he's in Europe, and there's this filmmaker, Conrad Rooks, who's doing this film called Chappaqua, and he's buddies with Peter Max in New York. And so somehow, like, they decide that he has to come over to New York City. So they bring him over to like New York in like 1966, and he comes and he's like, he just came from like Hong Kong. He's got like this lightweight coat and like, his sandals or something. And it's like the middle of winter in New York City. And he goes to start, he just goes to Peter's house, and Peter invites all these people over to the house, and he starts speaking to them, and they were all like, you don't get to leave. Like, you have to stay here. There's no way we can let you go. And I have the most beautiful letter that he wrote back to one of his, this woman, Sohini, who was back in India at the time. And the letter is so sweet because it's one of the first letters he writes from the US. And he's just like, I'm here. I want to start a Divine Life Society branch. These people are really excited about yoga. I think, maybe I'll stay here for a little while. Well, it ends up that I think he goes home for like 2 months, and then he comes back, and basically like, we never let him go. We just kept him. We were like, no, you don't get to be Divine Life Society anymore. So I think when he came over here, Vishnu Devananda had already come over here to found, Shivananda Ashram. So Shivananda Ashram predates, I think, Integral Yoga by just even a few months. They're on 23rd Street, I think. And so, when he comes over here, Vishnu Devananda's like, hey, no, he can't start Divine Life Society in the West. That's my thing. So he ends up having to kind of start something else. And he had studied with Aurobindo. And I think this idea of integral yoga really resonated with him. And so they came up with this idea of like, okay, we'll call it integral yoga. One of the things that's really, I think, unique to integral yoga, TJ, is the fact that we are not just an asana-based path. We actually follow like 6 branches of yoga, and we practice them daily. So really, in today's day, I'm always really trying to ground this idea that yoga is a science. It is not, an exercise regimen. It is a science where, like, if you do a certain thing, you will get a prescribed result, and they have repeated it over and over again for years. Western science is kind of catching up with that now. But with integral yoga, we really look at it as an entire lifestyle. And so we practice like these 6 different branches as opposed to just asana or just meditation or just, one thing. So we have like Raja Yoga, Hatha Yoga, Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Jnana Yoga. We just integrate them all in. So it's kind of, and then of course, Swami Satchidananda was really passionate about interfaith work, probably because of those early years in India and traveling around India. And there were so many different religions there at the time. So you had Muslims and Jains and Buddhists and Sikhs and Hindus. And there was still a lot of fighting, particularly between the Muslims and the Hindus at the time. So this idea of interfaith stuff really started to become really important to him. And so he started doing some of the first interfaith work in the West, where he was bringing together priests and rabbis, and they were doing this beautiful interfaith ritual and ceremony together.
Well,
so he was definitely like one of those early ones, over here in the 60s, of really founding like what we think of as modern yoga today in the West.
I think that's definitely true. And I appreciate that background on that kind of split between, maybe the split isn't the right word, but like the branch that happened where Swami Satchidananda went and created integral yoga. And then there's the Shivananda Yoga Center, because they both do kind of have a similar root, it seems to me, right?
Yeah, I mean, we still think of Shivananda Yoga as our lineage, because when we have monks, right, the Swamis that we have in our lineage, they are of that Saraswati lineage. So as far as like when we initiate people, we're initiating them into the Saraswati lineage. But many people come to integral yoga after being at Shivananda, and they're like, This is kind of similar, but it's not really exactly the same. And they don't always understand why. And that's one of the reasons is also, like I said, he had that influence before where he did study with many different teachers. And so when he got to the point where he was teaching and he was speaking and sharing his wisdom of yoga, I think that really influenced his impact that he, or his information that he shared with everybody.
I think that's true. It's a conversation I've been having on the show quite a bit recently around like people trying to source things like where they came from and how much, how much sometimes someone can say, like a teacher can say, yes, this is my teacher said this to me, and there's like an actual reference, or you can be citing like a text or something. But then that there is also some element where there is how it comes through that teacher. And I don't think that means that some people think that means it's made up. Oh, they just made stuff up. But I think that's part of the process of like transmission and teaching though, maybe, Like, what do you think are the distinctions between Integral and Shivananda? Like, can you say something about what you think makes them different? Other than the fact that they kind of come from two different spiritual leaders.
Well, one thing that I think we definitely have like more of this integrated lifestyle. I think Shivananda is much more, Master Shivananda was so direct. He was very much into like self-realization and meditation and discipline. And Swami Satchidananda was much more like, you want to integrate this into everything you do, and you want to make it work also in this modern setting. Because Master Shivananda was not teaching to Westerners in the 60s. He was teaching to a very specific group of people who already were familiar with yoga and Hinduism and all of these different concepts. Meanwhile, Swami Satchidananda comes over and he's teaching to people that this is all really new to them. And again, he starts to integrate in some of this like Shiva Shakti Tantra tradition of even some of the rituals we have or the way that we, utilize different, worship services and the pujas. Like he was a temple priest in India at a Nataraj temple when he was young. And so we even have like this beautiful Nataraj shrine in Yogaville. And the worship service that we do at that shrine is very traditional, Western traditional, I should say. We try to keep it very traditional compared to like what they would be doing in India at that same shrine that he worked at. So we do puja there, most days of the week. I think they do puja. They used to do it every day, but I don't know whether, they've kept that up during COVID. But I think it's those traditions that you don't necessarily see like the same stuff in Shivananda. And honestly, Jay, I gotta be perfectly honest with you. Like, I am not the most, I don't know. I don't understand the yoga world like the way some people do. I'm not really somebody who studied a lot of traditions. I am really just like integral yoga because that's what I was born and raised in. And then I did, 12 years of schooling in Yogaville, where from first grade all the way through high school, I just was steeped in integral yoga all day, every day. So I've never really, it wasn't even until I got like older, maybe in my 30s or even 40s, where I started being like, maybe I should learn about some of these other yoga traditions and see what's up.
Well, even what you just shared about like the tantric influence, I think that's significant because I have always thought like if you see Swami, that means renunciate, and renunciate paths are not necessarily householder paths. Now that doesn't mean that Swamis, even like in other traditions, like in Tibetan Buddhism traditions, still help householders in their lives, but that often like a Tantra taught like the integration into one's life. And that is what kind of makes it a little bit different than like a purely ascetic path or something.
Yeah, and I think that's where like those early years of Swami Satchidananda really influenced, because when we have an ashram, we don't have a traditional ashram in the sense that it's just renunciates living at an ashram or people who are giving up, who are, renouncing everything to live there. We actually have this huge community of people, householders that live there and support the ashram. And I think that was kind of one of the things that was sort of unique about Yogaville, and still is very unique about Yogaville, is we have this community of like 300 people that live there full time, surrounding the actual ashram grounds.
Did you, when you were growing up, like leave the ashram to go to school? Yeah.
So I actually, you mean like
first through, like, I don't know, like when you were in elementary school and stuff?
No. So we actually had a school there, the Yogaville Vidyalayam.
Oh, so you went to like a elementary school and like high school at Yogaville?
I did.
Wow. I didn't know they had that for the families only, or were there other kids who came from outside the community and also went to that school?
It was mostly just the families. We did have some kids that came and like boarded with different families to go to the school. It was actually one of the reasons why my parents chose integral yoga, because my mom, we had 6 kids in my family, and my mom was so passionate about finding a place where they had some program for children. And at the time, I think, Ananda Ashram had a school out in California, I think. And Kundalini, they sent their kids to India. So we were really it was such a weird, unique situation to be like raised in this ashram environment, studying yoga every day, but doing it in the West. And in some ways, it was like this extraordinary experiment that was wildly successful. And in some ways, it broke down sometimes, where it didn't really make sense. Or, sometimes we struggled as we got older, and we tried to integrate some of what was going on into, our adulthood. It was a fascinating way to...
Was there ever a moment where you thought, my parents are crazy, and rebelled against it?
No, that never really happened for me. I mean, certainly I think for some of my friends, they had a little bit more of that reaction. I was, like I said, I was always very close to Swami Satchidananda. So I always had this feeling I came here for a reason. My parents always really reiterated that too. You have your own karma, and you were born into this of your own, experience. And so you get to have your own experience with it. So I never really rebelled, but certainly in my 20s, I mean, you're raised for 12 years and you have to do hatha and meditation every single day. And I say have to, because when you're a teenager, you're like, oh my God.
Yeah, you're I imagine you want to go become an investment banker or something,
Well, interestingly, I did end up working on Wall Street for a little while.
Oh, well, you see, there you go. That's rebelling. You see, if your parents are investment bankers, you go be a yoga teacher.
Right.
But if your parents are living at the ashram, you go work on Wall Street. So when did that happen? How old were you when you did that?
So I was actually almost 30. I had lived in New York, like I said, when I was really, right out of high school. And that was kind of intense to try to figure out how to integrate all that. But I got into an acting school. And so I wanted to come up here and be an actor, and then realized that was not really what I wanted to be doing. So I moved back to Virginia, and, in my 20s, I was a 20-year-old. I went out to bars and I drank alcohol and, dated boys. We weren't allowed to date when we were growing up, and we weren't allowed to drink alcohol, and they were very careful with the movies we watched and the music we listened to, because they wanted to be, they were trying this experiment. What happens if you really try to protect these young people? And we were doing, kind of some advanced practices at a very young age. So in my 20s, when we started kind of experimenting with alcohol and things like that, some mental health stuff started to come up for quite a few of us. Looking back now, Jay, I really do think it had a little bit to do with, if you are going to have somebody who's going to be raised in this pure environment, following these practices. I mean, you probably know this. You've been on the yoga path long enough. If you try to do these really advanced practices and then you put toxins in your body, you're going to find out, right? Like,
I mean,
your body is going to give you feedback.
Sometimes the effects of practices that come out of like mystical spiritual traditions are destabilizing if you have to live in certain context in the world. We've talked about that. Like enlightenment might not be the best thing if you got a mortgage to pay or something, you know?
Right. Or like if you're doing, you know, advanced pranayamas, maybe you shouldn't be smoking cigarettes. Right? Because it can actually like knock you out of balance. Like your body has got to be in a certain state of purity. That's the reason why, you know, Swami Satchidananda was always like, keep your body pure. So that when you're doing these practices, it's not going to go haywire and you're not going to like knock yourself out of balance. And so I do think, because we did have sort of a high incident of mental health issues in our young people growing up, that was part of what ended up happening with us. Is I think like when we got older and we started, you know, not living as pure of a life, that those practices that we had done, or if we tried to go back and just jump back into them, it was really destabilizing for us. So anyway, so I was trying to get to Wall Street.
That makes sense. You end up at Wall Street with the, you know. Well, but there's a backlash. There's a backlash in a way. Like if you like you say, like essentially a bit of a bubble, because you're pulled out of you didn't have all these other influences that other kids your age might have been having. And there's probably advantages to that, but then maybe that doesn't, like I said, always make sense. It might make sense for some, but not everybody, but that there would be a backlash when you did like leave the ashram and go out into the world. There might be, I would imagine, some kind of backlash to that.
Well, I also think we were taught like it doesn't matter, right? It's all Maya. So it doesn't matter whether you're working on Wall Street or you're sitting in a cave meditating. Like the idea is to bring this peace with you throughout everything you do. However, now I realize like you got to keep up the practices. You have to be doing like, you know, the sadhana is like important for a reason. And if you're trying to just be out in the world doing things without that grounding, then yeah, it can definitely go haywire. So basically, like in 2000, my sister wanted to come up here. My little sister, she's 10 years younger than me. She wanted to come up and go to FIT. And so I came up with her because I didn't want her to move to New York by herself. And I was working for a temp agency and somehow ended up working for a hedge fund at 140 Broadway. And worked there for about 2 years. And of course, September 11th, 2001, we know what happened. And I was working a block away from the World Trade Center, and I was standing on the street when the first building fell. And, you know, it was such a pivotal moment. I mean, it's a pivotal moment for everybody in this probably world, but it was such a pivotal moment for me in my journey because it was such a huge crisis of faith for me that I don't think I'd ever really experienced quite to that extent. And luckily, Swami Satchidananda was still alive at the time, and really helped guide me through this experience because I got really depressed and I got really anxious. And, you know, I was going to the doctor to see like how I could be stabilized, and they were just like giving us Xanax. And I was like, okay, I'll just take Xanax. Like, I don't know. And I got so out of balance. And I just remember Swami Satchidananda, she was always so sweet to me. Like, he never raised his voice. You hear some stories of some of the other people. I would get really fierce and everything, but he was never fierce with me. He was always so sweet. And, this was the only conversation where he got kind of strict with me. And he said to me, you know, my dad called and was like, Radha's, you know, she's getting really depressed. And so he's like, tell her to call me. And so I call him up and I'm like, hi, Gurudev, you know, I'm in trouble. And he says, look, he always called me Bunny. He said, Bunny, you either have fear or you have faith. There is no in between. And I was like, but Gurudev, no, you don't understand. Like, all these people died, and it's like, I'm still working there, and it's so much stress, and everybody's so sad. He's like, you either have fear or faith. There is no in between. And I feel like for the last 20 years, that has been my sadhana. That's been my work, is like really absorbing that lesson of like, you either have fear or faith. There is no in between. And in any given moment, that's what I get to choose, is like, am I going to be in faith right now, or am I going to be in fear? And I would like to say I've mastered it, Jay, but I have not. There are still plenty of moments of fear. But one of the other things that he always said that is so powerful for me is somebody asked him a question of, how do you know it's God's will? And he said, because it is done. And I repeat that to myself pretty much every single day. Like, you know, as I'm walking through my life and my job and crazy things are happening and the boiler's broken down and, you know, the ceiling's leaking in the institute and we've got 10 teachers that called out in one day and all the kind of things that are happening. And the way that I really maintain that like equilibrium is to just remember that like those two lessons of like, you either have fear or you have faith. And how do you know it's God's will? Because it's done. And the second it's done, then you just know and you let it go. You're like, okay, it couldn't have happened any other way. So let me just take what's right in front of me and go from there.
Well,
so that was a weird segue from my topic.
I think that the dynamic between fear and faith has been true in my life as well. And I think it's interesting. It does matter like what you have faith in, and you said God's will. And I think that's something higher to have faith in. I've talked about that on the show recently. And honestly, in the yoga world, you talked about this earlier, how you didn't come into the yoga world that I came into, where a lot of times we took God out of it. and as time went on, and I guess this is sort of what I'm curious about now, it did seem like over time things changed, even in the course of my adulthood, coming into my adulthood, where things got bigger and like more standardized sometimes, and like the institutions grew, you know? Did you see that? Like, what was the relationship between like Yogaville and like the centers?
Yeah, it's so fascinating that, I mean, yoga in some ways has become a business, right? We're in the business of yoga. And yoga is not a business. It's not meant to be a business. Yoga is an ancient, again, science that has been passed down for 5,000 years. We have definitely tried to take yoga, and it's interesting what you're saying. Like, there's a lot of talk lately about like post lineage, post guru, post this, post that yoga, which I always say all yoga is good yoga. I'm not trying to be judgmental about what people want to do with yoga. I'm like, if you want to go do yoga in a gym, at least you're doing some kind of yoga and it's going to be great for you. But I do feel like people miss out on the power of the teachings and this incredible ancient science when they try to make it fit into their construct of what they want it to look like. And so, part of it is this guru tradition that is very hard for us Westerners to kind of tap into, right? We are individuals. Like when you grow up in America, it is all about individualism. What's best for the individual? I want to make my way in the world. Where's my piece of the pie? My American dream? All of these things that really are not in sync with this ancient tradition of it's God's will, and you're giving up your ego, and there's a humbling factor. And somebody recently said to me, well, in yoga, don't they talk about setting boundaries? And I'm like, not really. Like, well, it boundaries are not really a thing.
Sometimes they're breaking boundaries away. Sometimes there are there. Yeah, it's true.
But it's not like a thing like in a Western world where like, I should have boundaries around this. In yoga, it's like, no, whatever's happening to me, then I get to see how I'm reacting to it. And it's all about my growth and my path. But it's just so interesting to see like how the West has taken this tradition, taken these teachings, and in some ways transformed them in amazing ways and made them accessible to everybody. I mean, I remember when I was in India, probably in 1997, and I was giving a talk at the Rotary Club. And this guy comes up to me afterwards and says, he's like in tears. This man, he's probably in his like early 60s. And he's crying. And he says, "Thank you so much for teaching me yoga." And of course, I'd just given a talk. I don't even remember what my talk was about. He said, "Here in India, it's so hard to find a teacher that will teach you. And I smoke cigarettes. And none of them will let me learn yoga until I give up cigarettes first. And you were the first one who's been like, don't worry about it. It's okay. Like, practice the yoga and all of your addictions will fall aside." Meanwhile, here in the West, right? So here's this guy. He's like, I got to go sweep floors for, 10 years before I'm going to get any yoga taught to me. And here in the West, we're like, hey, just go down to the local gym and we'll teach you these really powerful, subtle practices. Right? Because Hatha yoga is a very powerful practice. It is really, it can change your parasympathetic nervous system. It can increase your dopamine. It can reduce your cortisol. I mean, there's all this stuff that's going on just by doing these physical postures. And we're just like teaching it at the gym. Whereas before, you had to be of a certain caste and you had to again, go sweep floors in front of the guru's hut for 10 years before he'd even look at you.
I've said that. Every teacher training I've ever done, I started by saying that up until not that long ago, if you wanted to learn yoga, you had to go seek out and find a teacher and then prove that you were worthy.
Yeah.
Like you didn't just pay for it and then get it. But I will touch back on something that you said about post-lineage yoga, because that's certainly a conversation that's kind of played out on this show and in my life, because the reason that has been is, in all of these traditions, there have been scandals and abuses. And I personally, in my own life, had a teacher who, I got so much benefit from and helped me more than any other teacher I've ever had, but then exhibited behaviors that I am not comfortable condoning. And so having to reconcile that, and I've had in the past conversations on here when it was happening in the Ashtanga world where I felt like I honestly didn't think I had very constructive conversations about it, where it was just like fueling kind of animosity and polarization. And I'm not interested in like litigating people's personal pasts in public,
Yeah.
But I will say that I know some folks who within the integral tradition itself have questions and aren't happy with the way the institution has responded. So I guess I'm curious for you, as someone who was so close to the man, how do you feel about the potential misgivings that have happened?
So, it's interesting that you're asking that, Jay, because like you're saying, it's much more complicated than most people would like it to be. Most people want it to be very black or white. And I understand that, and I'm not judging people for that. But I do think it's very nuanced. You have to look at if I'm looking at the overall picture of when many of these teachers came to the West, they were bringing these Eastern traditions to a Western environment, in a very specific environment. And I think we can all agree that something went haywire, right? I think we can all say whatever happened when these teachers came over in the 60s and tried to integrate this hippie Western Woodstock, whatever, free love, whatever was going on in the 60s, which, even to me today would seem a little wild. And then they tried to come in and share this yoga that something went kind of weird. It is interesting when you go back to India and the way that India sees gurus or talks about gurus. and their acceptance of the gurus with all of their, I would not even say, in my experience, when you go over to India and you're at the ashrams there's just a total faith in the guru. And so there's not the same also questioning about what the guru is doing. I appreciate the fact that we live in the West. I appreciate the fact that we live in a world where we question these things, right? And I appreciate the fact that we're looking at these things now. And I also think that, like, too often people will.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.